Welcome to the Lead with Levity podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Walker, and I am happy to introduce this next episode. This next episode is for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about facilitation. It's kind of a Wizard of Oz episode where Dorothy goes and she finally meets the wizard and then she realizes that the wizard is not this grand character that is pulling all the strings of Oz and doing all of these things. He's not magical, although what he does often seems magical. She gets to pull back the curtain and see, oh, there's a dude back there pulling all the strings and doing all of these things. It's a machine. There's a process. There is a mechanism for making all of this magic happen. That's what this episode is about. What is the mechanism for making the magic happen when you bring a group of people together and you want to facilitate conversations, you want to facilitate ideas, you want certain things to flow? That is a skill set, y'all. That's something that sometimes people feel like it's something that requires magical superpowers, but it doesn't. It requires a certain level of sensitivity to all of the group dynamics. It requires a skill set, the ability to communicate, the ability to synthesize ideas, the ability to say, ooh, there's a connection between what you said and what you said. The ability to look around the room and see, oh, they're confused over there. Let me restate what someone said and check in and make sure that I said it in a way that they intended it to come out. You know, I facilitate conversations myself, workshops, all of the time. And I've definitely had conversations with people before where they say, oh, Heather, or oh, Dr. Heather, Dr. Walker, whatever they call me. You were so good at this. How do you do it? Or you were just, I guess it's just, you're just born like that. No, no, this is practice over time. I do see that some people are better at it than others. And so I want to make sure that we're giving space today to this conversation, because if you don't see yourself as a facilitator, that is fine. But you may actually be doing more facilitation work in your day-to-day, in your 9 to 5, than you even realize. So I think you're going to get something from this episode if you're trying to figure out, how do I get people together, get them to kind of calm down long enough, be engaged and focused and present long enough to get this message. How do I do that? This episode is for you. Our guest today is Dr. Myriam Hadnes. She actually has a PhD in behavioral economics, and she is a self-proclaimed facilitation evangelist. Am I saying anything right today? It seems like I'm not. She is a facilitation evangelist. And she's going to share some of the strategies that have helped her, some things to watch out for, as well as some misconceptions about facilitation today. I hope you enjoy this episode.
It's time for a sneak peek. Sneak peek, sneak peek.
So when I think of facilitation in the workplace, I think of team leaders who don't want to micromanage, but to create an atmosphere where their teams can thrive and collaborate with each other. And I'm thinking of a project manager who is basically facilitating the project because they are not doing the work, but they're relying on the work of others for this to happen. So all these roles where there are different people coming together to do work, all of this needs to be facilitated.
And now, on with the show.
When you're feeling the pressure, take a moment to step back, pick up your marbles, and choose to lead with levity. Join us on the Lead with Levity podcast for fireside chats that will fill your bucket and help you get back to being the leader you were meant to be. Now here's your host, Dr. Heather Walker.
Welcome back to the Lead with Levity podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Walker, and I have the pleasure of sharing this microphone, this time today with Dr. Myriam Hadnes. Dr. Hadnes is a behavioral economist, a facilitation evangelist, and the host of Workshops Work podcast. So, Dr. Hadnes, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm good. Suddenly the sun came out, so it's spring in Amsterdam. And I'm here with you to dive into a conversation.
Yes. So I see some nice long walks in your future. After this podcast, maybe you can go enjoy nature.
I will. And I'm a runner, so sun is great.
Oh, nice. So Myriam, as an evangelist, I make assumptions with that term that you are out there sharing the good news about facilitation and what that can bring to people's lives, how that can help their organizations, how that can help people become more connected. When I think about facilitation, I think about ideas flowing like a flow, right? What does it mean to you?
Thank you. I recently started a fun exercise with my podcast guests, and I invited them on the challenge. Facilitation is like blank. So mine was facilitation is like a bathtub. It's a strong container in which ideas can bubble up. So for me, facilitation is like a meta skill. It's similar to leadership, where you create a space where groups can grow larger than their parts, where you create a space where people can share their ideas, come together to collaborate, communicate just a little bit better and easier. So facilitation comes from the Latin facile, which is easy. So making things easier, allowing people to take off their masks and interact as human beings.
Yes, yes. And there are several skills. I see it that way as well when you're talking about making things easier, making it easier to communicate, but also making it easier to understand where the other person is coming from, making it easier for them to feel comfortable in the space, comfortable with ideas that maybe they wouldn't normally share with others. What kinds of barriers do you see people facing when they come in? What kinds of barriers does facilitation solve for?
My first idea was ego, but then I would replace ego by insecurity. So, because I think it's our own insecurity, maybe imposter syndrome, that puts us in a space where we have the impression that we need to protect ourselves and put on a mask to pretend as if we have all the answers, that we knows best. And that holds us back from being curious, from asking, for admitting that we don't know. And it's actually in this space where we can be vulnerable together. And vulnerable meaning that we can take small risks without fearing of being punished. So that's what we call psychological safety. And if we can create that and be human together, I think that's what facilitation really does. So create psychological safety, which becomes then a norm for people to communicate in a better way.
Yes. And I assume, and I don't want to assume, so I'm going to ask you, what kinds of things do you typically facilitate?
I facilitate meetings and workshops. So this would be for clients. I'm building and curating a community, so I'm facilitating conversations. And I love hosting parties. So I facilitate my guests and my friends to connect with each other by providing the space where this becomes a little bit easier. And maybe for a hands-on example, because when we think of facilitation, very often we think of workshops and meetings, so something that some people do and host, but air quotes, normal people don't. But for me, facilitation really starts with organizing a dinner for friends. And you don't expect your guests to bring their own food. And
That's true.
And when we
Unless
come to
it's
meeting,
a potluck.
Exactly.
Do you have potlucks there?
Yes, we do sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, for some dinners, that's true. A potluck, everyone would bring their own food, but usually when you invite, you think of whom to invite and whom not to invite, and whether people have some allergies and how to compose. And you would do the groceries before. And when you invite team members to a meeting, you don't expect them to prepare it, but you come prepared. You bring an
Yes.
agenda, you think whom to invite and whom not to invite, and how to stitch the agenda points together. And for example, I hosted a party. It's a while ago already, but I think it's a nice example for what facilitation also can be. I have friends from all different parts of life, and they don't necessarily know each other. So when they come to my place, it's too easy for them to speak about, how do you know Myriam? And what do you do for a living? Which is
The
quite
basic
boring.
questions.
The basic
Yes.
questions. So when I invited them, I put on the invite that they shall wear a T-shirt that tells a story about themselves. So when they arrived, they would ask about the story on their T-shirt. And suddenly they got into conversations and found all these similarities and got really absorbed and focused and didn't have to talk about what kind of jobs they would do outside of this party. And that's
Nice.
facilitation.
That is so cool. That's really beautiful because you've prepared them for something different, which I think is important when we're thinking about facilitation. I want our listeners to be able to get into this and to see how this might fit within their world as well, because they may not see themselves as facilitators, but they facilitate conversations all the time. And it's important to get your guests ready for a different experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that might look like in the workplace?
So when I think of facilitation in the workplace, I think of team leaders who don't want to micromanage, but to create an atmosphere where their teams can thrive and collaborate with each other. And I'm thinking of a project manager who is basically facilitating the project because they are not doing the work, but they're relying on the work of others for this to happen. So all these roles where there are different people coming together to do work, all of this needs to be facilitated in the way that how does communication happen? What is the best channel? Is a meeting necessary? Who's invited to the meeting? What happens after the meeting? How do we relate to each other? And all these things are facilitation. And then there are facilitation skills that I think are very similar to any leadership skills, like asking questions instead of assuming the answers, listening to and providing space for the lower voices and maybe the shy voices to be heard, to make sure that we get access to all the different perspectives and not only the loud ones. So all these small things that actually make big difference. And I mentioned it before, the concept of psychological safety, and it was with Amy Edmondson that it became big after she showed, or after Google showed, that the one thing that distinguishes a thriving team from a mediocre team, psychological safety. And for me, psychological safety and facilitation are basically two things, or the same thing, where in order to create psychological safety, you need to listen, ask questions, create a space where team members feel safe enough to share their ideas, to ask questions, that they feel included, they feel a sense of belonging, and eventually they feel so safe that they dare to challenge each other. And for that, you need a leader to create that, to hold that space, and that's the container, the bathtub.
Yes. And typically leaders go first. So what kind of preparation does a leader need to have to be able to serve as that bathtub with, right? Not the leaky bathtub, but the good, solid,
Get
sturdy
into your
bathtub.
swimming gear. And I think, so I think first of all is this level of vulnerability. And I'm not talking about putting all your emotions on the plate, but it's daring to say that you don't know, asking questions, curious questions, and listening to the answers, being open to the possibility to be wrong. And I think it's in small things. So I think one action that can create the biggest impact in terms of psychological safety is to yes and what's being said. So yes,
Yeah, that improv technique.
absolutely. And I think there's a big misconception that we think that yes means yes, you're right, or yes, I agree. Whereas yes can simply mean yes, I hear you. Yes, I acknowledge that you have said something. Because when we answer with no, suddenly when we hear no, we go into our mind and we beat ourselves up. Why did I say that? Why didn't I ask the question? Why didn't I hold back? Internal dialogue. Whereas when we hear yes, we feel appreciated and we become curious, so we lean in. And I learned that from a brilliant professor once upon a time. Whenever I raised my hand, said something stupid, he said, "Yes, Miriam. And have you thought of?" And would say the exact opposite.
Ah.
And me, instead of falling into this internal dialogue, beating myself up, I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I learned something.
What would you say? I want to like look at the other side of this because I think there might be something very interesting here. What would you say is maybe a tough situation or a hard group to facilitate? So I know that some may be kind of scared of facilitating or not. They don't think that they are a facilitator and they don't facilitate every single day. What are some situations where facilitation is just maybe not possible or it's just
Love
really,
that
really
question.
tough?
Thank you. I think facilitation is always possible, or even necessary, and especially when situations seem tough. Most difficult groups to facilitate are those where you have participants or group members that are opinionated, that know it all, that love to speak a lot, or that dismiss others. And I think in these cases, the most important thing is to be very clear on your role as a facilitator. So if someone is stepping in, although they are not a facilitator with a capital F, let's say they're a project manager, and they are bringing a group of stakeholders together. And every stakeholder thinks that their problem is the most important problem in the room, and they need everyone to align on that. That's a difficult situation. So for the facilitators
Yes, it is.
to state, why is everyone here? So what is the purpose of the meeting? And what is the role of every stakeholder in that? So first they have to align on that, and everyone must be sure that they understand why they're there and what they try to accomplish together. And then the role of the facilitator. Okay, I am the project manager. Today, I am facilitating this meeting. We have limited amount of time. We want to hear all the voices. So I might interrupt you at some point if I notice that we're getting on a tangent. Are you okay with me doing that for the purpose of staying within this time limit? So get the permission to interrupt. And then if someone goes on the tangent, you can refer to that and like, you remember what we agreed upon? We don't have 5 hours. So may I interrupt you?
Right.
So these are small things. Once a coachee started laughing after we had a little bit of a conversation of how they can manage a group better. And I'm like, as a facilitator, I think you can never be clear enough. Nobody has ever complained about a facilitator being too clear. So
That's very true. And sometimes we don't realize I've heard managers and leaders say, "Well, I told them. I already said that." We underestimate how many times you need to communicate and maybe even needing to change your message just a little bit
and to give
until they
agency.
understand.
Nobody wants to be told something. Not even kids want to be told what to do. So we don't, if
Very
we are
true.
told what to do, maybe we agree. And maybe we agree because we actually didn't listen because we were answering our emails, because the meeting could have been an email. So we are not involved, we're not engaged. And then we are told, but we don't hear. And I think that's the biggest misconception is just because someone is present doesn't mean that they hear and get the message. Just because you send an email doesn't mean that someone reads it. And just because you invite someone to a meeting and they're sitting there physically doesn't mean that they're actually hearing, listening, absorbing the message you're sending.
How do you know when someone gets it?
Good question. I think there's a lot about body language. There is, when someone gets it and is engaged, they would ask questions or say something, engage. I think the next thing for a non-facilitator, non-capital F facilitator to facilitate, make sure that so after you aligned on the purpose and the roles, why is everyone there? Make sure that everyone speaks as early as possible in the meeting. Because not only does it create a sense of belonging, okay, there's a reason why I'm here, so I have permission to take space with my voice. And the earlier they have used their voice, the more likely they are to engage again.
I've seen that 100%. And it holds them accountable as well. So if they know for 30 minutes I'm not saying anything, you've lost them. By that point, they're picking up their phones, they're picking up their laptops, they're looking at other things to do because they recognize that this is actually free time.
Exactly.
You've just given them free time.
Yeah. And then to create moments where they can actually engage, because nobody wants to waste their time. And everyone is happy to contribute if they have the impression that it matters. And it's staring, especially online. I think another thing we underestimate is when we have online meetings, it takes a lot of courage and psychological safety to actually unmute yourself and say something, or even to ask a question. Whereas when we're in the physical space together, what we would do is we exchange a glance with someone, maybe we turn to our neighbor, maybe we whisper, we exchange, okay, just to make sure that what we're about to say or ask is not totally stupid. And when we're meeting online, we don't have this opportunity unless explicitly given.
Right.
So for someone might think, oh, I learned in this facilitation course that I have to ask questions and invite everyone to share their opinion. And then they invite everyone and nobody dares to say something because it doesn't feel safe and they don't know how to do that. So to either give them the chance to first put everything in the chat, it's a little bit less daring, or to create breakout rooms. You know what? Just break out, turn to your neighbor, literally. Break out to smaller groups, discuss what you've heard from this meeting. What is important to you? What questions do you have? Then come back and ask your questions. And this just lowers the bar.
Yeah. Yeah. It gives them an opportunity to reconnect with the group, to say, wait a second, we heard the facilitator say this. Is this true for us? Does this still make sense? Is this clear? Yes. And how would a facilitator know if the content and what they want to share is worthy of an actual meeting, or if it's something that should not be a meeting?
I think if the voices of those in the space matter, it's worth a meeting. For me, it's about our resources. So when we are sharing our time and attention in real time together, then we must make the best out of it. So I think even for a webinar, if it could have been a YouTube video, send me the link and I will watch it at a time that is convenient for me. Why do I have to sit during my most precious time to watch someone talk if I cannot ask questions or interact? So I think for me, it's about honoring the wisdom that's in the room. And that sounds very facilitator language. But what it actually means is everyone in the space has something to contribute. Everyone has knowledge and experience and expertise. And not to honor that and not to offer the opportunity to everyone to share that is actually disrespecting the people you invited to the space.
Yeah, yeah. So if we're not going to honor the wisdom in the room or call upon the wisdom in the room, we probably don't need a meeting. We need another way of conveying this information.
Write an email.
Do you follow a specific framework when you're thinking about facilitating? Anyone who's interested in learning about this and how they can get better themselves, what frame do you recommend?
I have my own little blueprint. So whenever I host a meeting or a workshop, I start with welcoming. Usually I play some music, especially in the online space. I I remind them of the purpose. This is why we are here. And then I create a turn to your neighbor moment. especially online, saying that if we would meet in the physical space, the most natural thing we do after we sit down is we turn to our neighbor and we say hello and we exchange a few words. So I would send them into a breakout room, either one-on-one or in small groups of 3, say, turn to your neighbor. The Zoom gods will decide who your neighbor is, and then answer a question. And then it can be any question between how are you really, to what brings you here together today, what is the most important thing you would like to get out of this meeting, what would you like to leave behind, what is the one thing you would like to ignore for the next half hour, 1 hour, 2 hours. Because it also creates a little bit of shared humanity, and they realize that they're all human, they all have something that they would like to ignore. Everyone is overwhelmed.
Yes. Everyone is
And everyone has
right
been
now.
overwhelmed for the last 5 years, if not for the last decade. And I think that's the next thing, for just to acknowledge that. Like, okay, I know we are coming here together for this meeting. I'm sure you have other things you would prefer to work on. So let's make sure that we use this time wisely and that everyone contributes.
Yes. So acknowledging the elephant in the room. Does anyone have an emergency that would keep them from being present today? Let's make sure that we address these things. Because you're right. It's hard to have a good meeting. It's hard to have a good conversation when you're not where your feet are, right? When you're not fully present and engaged and you've got something else going on in the back of your mind.
One thing that works extremely well for corporates, whenever I facilitate for corporate teams, when we arrive, while everyone is still dropping in, I say, okay, take a piece of paper and a pen and download everything that could distract you in the next X minutes. Write it all down. The phone call you have to make, the email you have to send, the grocery, the thoughts, everything, write it down, fold it and put it aside. It will still be there when we're finished. And it just helps to offload everything, to then be fully present, to stop exactly the overthinking that you mentioned, because we cannot stop it. It's there, it's noise.
It's very true. So, Myriam, that's something that I do sometimes at nighttime, because I've noticed that when I'm really creative, I don't sleep well. When I have to work on projects where I'm building, designing, which is all the time, I don't sleep very well when I'm in those moments. And so I've learned over the years that if you sit down and you write everything that's stressing you out on a piece of paper, it makes it so much easier to go to bed because you don't feel like you have to retain all of that in your memory. And so I've seen that in other places that works so well. I'm glad to hear that it works well during a workshop as well. One thing that I'm wondering about is, how did you actually get into this? Because as you know, most people don't consider themselves facilitators first. Something kind of allowed that to come into their lives. So what was that
funny
for
that you mention it. I think I interviewed 266 facilitators on my podcast, and I only had one who graduated high school thinking, oh, I want to become a facilitator. For me, I didn't even know the word facilitator until I think 5 years ago. Although when I look back, I used to be an academic. And now looking back, I was facilitating the lectures to the students, because as my first position, I was teaching economics to Vietnamese students. So a socialist country who didn't know about economics, but they were so eager to learn that when they arrived at the first lecture, they had read the textbook already. So I arrived there in my late 20s, total imposter syndrome, and we're like, what can I teach them if they have read the textbook? They must know more about economics than I do. So
at this point.
Yeah. And then I started using classroom experiments and role play to facilitate the content and to make it easier for them to absorb. But then I really got into it. Wow. So I ended up working in university strategy and quit that job, but saw what can happen to an organization if you give voice to the different groups and if you empower the employees. And I was working on a bottom-up strategy process to rethink a research university. So what will a research university, model research university of the future look like? And we had workshops with professors and lobbyists
Cool.
and ministers and students and administrators. And it was just this beautiful creative space until the minister changed and had
Yes.
different plans for all of that. And then my office was replaced by a team by McKinsey. And then observing what happens to an organization when you give them this creative power and then you take it away. And I was fascinated by that and just wanted to learn more. So got interested in
Yeah.
organizational
Yeah.
development and different HR positions. But then as an academic, as a recovering academic, it was difficult to find a normal employment. So
I
that's how I got
understand.
into facilitation. I was redesigning my life in Amsterdam at some point and started a meetup that I called Idea Parties. Bring your ideas, we'll brainstorm on a solution. And later learned that this was
Yes.
facilitation.
Oh, yeah. So when you're, as a recovering academic, I'm wondering if you ever experience the tension between content and facilitation. And do you have a recommendation? Is it 50-50? Is it, 30% content, the rest should be conversation and facilitation? What is the
I think
rule of
it really
thumb there?
depends. It depends on your audience and how much they already know. And it depends on how much time you have. And I think it also depends a little bit on your personality. So I may be on the extreme of trusting the group that they know and they can figure it out. And I think they can remember best if they found the solution themselves. So there's a concept of experiential learning where you start with introducing a problem and then they find and discuss the solution and bring all the different perspectives in and then share it to the group. And then I would only add whatever they have left out, or I would help them to make sense of what has been said. So this is my preferred way of training. Or I would introduce a model and then let them explore what this actually means and how to relate it to their own realities. Because at the end of the day, we only absorb content and only remember it when it somehow is useful for our own life. And for me, this is the facilitation bit. So, how can we make it easy for the learners to link the content to their personal life experience and to their problems? And if we can make this connection easy, then they will also
Yes.
be interested in learning more and actually remembering the content.
Yes, yes. So I think that's a good segue into a scenario. We sent this out a little bit earlier, but I want to bring this scenario back up. It's a situation where we have a manager, her name is Sarah, and she works in a manufacturing plant. And she often finds herself in a situation where the demands of work, the deadlines, the targets, we need to get all of this product out of the door as quickly as possible so that we can fulfill these orders, leaves her in a place where she doesn't really bring a warm touch to her team. So her team members have noticed that she prioritizes work over them. She'll ask them to come in for long hours. There's a sort of a disconnect. She doesn't meet with the team. There's no team building. And they're kind of frustrated by that. They feel like cogs in a machine. So if you were brought in to work with Sarah, where would you begin?
I would first begin with empathy. Haven't we all been Sarah at some point? And I think
Oh, yeah.
we can be Sarah in our private context and we can be Sarah in the office context. And I think this sense of overwhelm that everything is too much and we have to work harder and run faster. And the harder we work and the faster we run, the more work we actually generate. And there are a few things. So I think one is helping Sarah to feel safe again and to ask the team for help. Because what seems to happen is a disconnect between Sarah, who thinks that as a team lead, she has to fix it all and she has to give directions because they have to keep the deadlines.
Yeah.
So what happens when we are stressed is we get into this very narrow mind of, okay, we need to get the work done. And then we start running, especially when we are high achievers. And when we're team leaders, we tend to be high achievers. That's what got us there. And we know how it works best. So everyone has to obey by our rules now. it doesn't work like that. And this creates a disconnect. So to
Right.
pause a second and then tell the team, okay, listen, we have overcommitted, or this is too much. All hands on deck. I need help. Who can do what? How can we make the
Yes.
best out of all of our superpowers? And then it creates ownership for the team.
Yes.
It shows
Yes.
vulnerability of Sarah. And we love to help. There's a human instinct, and unless we're sociopaths, to help each other. So if someone asks for help, we are willing to help. And then the funny thing is that then the team will most likely be happy to work a little bit overtime because they are not asked to, but they want to contribute and make this work. So asking for help and sharing the burden with the team, I think, is one thing. The next is to look how they meet, because what often happens, and it's crazy, especially since the pandemic and after, how many meetings there are in corporates. And the problem is that the
Yes.
outcome of a bad meeting are more meetings. So we bring people together and everyone is so stressed that nobody has actually brain power to focus on that meeting. So they only listen 50%. So there are a lot of
That's right.
misunderstandings. Then the meeting is over. Nobody really understands what has been aligned, or maybe some decisions are being made because everyone agreed because nobody disagreed. And then it's only after the meeting in the one-on-ones that people realize that actually there is no agreement. So they have to fix all these misunderstandings.
Yeah, I've had some time to sleep.
And then you have so many more
Yes.
meetings to fix all of that. Nobody has time to prepare the meetings. What also often happens is I didn't have time to do the work, but there's a cognitive dissonance. I don't want to be the person who didn't have time to do the work. So I want to be seen as the person who actually does it. So I want to show everyone. What do? I invite everyone to a meeting on this topic, hoping that the work and everything kind of will get done. I will get some perspectives. I get some status update, but it's actually just wasting everyone's time because I feel bad that I didn't do the work.
Wow.
So I think there is no simple answer, but I think the different ingredients of asking for help and engaging the team, being more effective in the meetings and having fewer meetings better prepared, and taking a step back and looking at the priorities again.
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully this hasn't been happening for a really long time to the point where now the team does not want to help anymore. But Sarah may need to come out and say, I own this. I have not been as supportive as I need to be. I haven't been available. I haven't been doing certain things to make sure that our team can function in the way that it needs to function. And I apologize for that. And I'm going to do better. And I need your help to do better. So I think that there's a little bit of repair that needs to happen as well.
Totally.
Repairing those relationships. So when you think about facilitating groups, where is the fun? Where does fun come into this equation?
How do you define fun? I mean, fun is different for everyone, right? But I think fun doesn't necessarily mean playing games. For me, fun is lightness. Fun is creativity. Fun is engagement and maybe ownership. I think usually people have fun and enjoy themselves when they get into flow, when they can bring in their own ideas. And I think this usually happens when we feel safe, because then we don't have to cover our ass. So we have fun when we can be ourselves and maybe show a side of ourselves that we usually don't show.
And play with different ideas.
And then, exactly, maybe a brainstorm, and it can sometimes even be a check-in or how to get to know each other better. The question, if you had a superpower, what would it be? And usually we are surprised. Fun also has to do with surprise. Learning something about someone that we wouldn't have expected, or even about ourselves, and then having a giggle together. Fun comes when we can share a moment of humanity, like, oh, you have this too. And I think that's what we can learn from stand-up comedians, right? Stand-up comedy is funny because they're holding a mirror to us and they're speaking out a truth that nobody actually dares to speak out. I'm like, you too?
Yes. Or we didn't realize how absurd that thing that we took so
Exactly.
seriously
And that's fun.
is. Yes.
So actually being human together is fun without silly games.
Yes. Yes. So what is on the horizon for you, Myriam?
I started evangelization of facilitation, of course. I through 3 channels actually. So I'm hosting a community of facilitators, and we just started courses. So to help non-facilitators
Okay.
and facilitators embrace the craft of facilitation. And I am working with community members as associates to also give training for large corporates who want to increase psychological safety amongst their remote workforce. So we go in and not only train what facilitation means, but show them how psychological safety feels. And thereby they
Yes.
learn and
Yes.
can create psychological safety for themselves and for others through facilitation. And I'm currently working on a collective book project on a simple guide on how to save the world through facilitation. Yeah.
It's simple, right?
And it's how to make it fun. It's a little bit
Okay.
absurd. It's maybe reaching over the top, but it's a fun project.
A simple guide on how to save the world through facilitation. When is that coming out?
So hopefully tomorrow.
Okay. Exactly, because it's just that simple. Now, the community of facilitators, what is that called? Where is it? How can we find it?
Because it started with a working title where I invited my podcast guest to a conference, and the only condition for them to host a workshop was that they should do something they've never done before. And we realized that this creates fun and trust and vulnerability. So we continued running with it, and now it's an entire community where we embrace taking risks and trying the new stuff and having vulnerable conversations. It's neverdonebefore.org.
Wow. That's exciting.
Yeah.
.org. Okay. All right. I'll have to look into that one. I feel like I am doing things I've never done before.
Every day.
At least once a quarter.
Maybe
yes,
more often.
Yes. Probably more often. Yes, 100%. Myriam, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. If anyone is interested in learning more about you and everything that you have to offer, where should they go?
LinkedIn. Easy.
LinkedIn? Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful journey as you go out there and create more facilitators.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation, for your curiosity. It really means a lot, Heather.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lead with Levity podcast. To get resources mentioned in this episode and find out what we're all about, check us out at leadwithlevity.com.